So Jane and I were talking about the way that y'all were constructing these forms, and we were very impressed by how quickly y'all picked it up. This is a wonderful construction kit. We've used it for some time, and it really allows you to put these geometries together in a very fast, efficient form. And it's really through building the forms that you really understand them. It's one thing to see them, it's another thing to build them. And then you get a sense of the structure and their interrelationships and the angles and the shapes that are involved. So building it is absolutely critical. And again, these building sets of the Zoom tool that we required you to have for this training really make this very fast and efficient. Jane and I were kind of commiserating between ourselves about the old days and what we went through in building these forms. And you know, it's like when your parents told you that in their days they walked 20 miles through the snow and you damn kids get to ride the bus sort of thing. But that's how it was for us. We were like telling the story about back many years ago when we were building the forms out of marshmallows and toothpicks, which worked great in December, but then in July it turned into a mass of syrup and goo. And so these are much more effective. So we're going to be working more with these forms, and you're even going to have particular little meditations that you do with certain ones of them, and we'll be pointing out certain interrelationships between them. But let's start right now and going into the deeper aspects of what these forms are all about. So one of the most fundamental aspects of understanding these forms, and again, if you would please hold questions or comments till the end today, we'll make time for all of that. One of the most fundamental things is the attribution of the elemental forces to the different shapes. And so this is written up in your handouts, and there's many other books available about it. Again, the basic idea is that the tetrahedron is related to the element of fire. And let's remember that the tetrahedron is the minimal form to contain three-dimensional space with straight lines. You cannot do it with less form than you have with the tetrahedron. 4 faces, 4 points, 6 lines. That is the minimum system to enclose physical space. And when you study the work of Buckminster Fuller, and I have in your resource guide some of his most important texts for y'all to check out, particularly for those of you involved with design or architecture, Bucky's works like Synergetics are like the Bible. They're so important. And then there are other books available like Bucky Works. These books tend to be hard to find. Synergetics has been out of print since the 70s, but it's actually posted on the internet. But it's so huge, it's like 1,000 pages, that to work with the internet copy is fairly difficult. And so sometimes it's better to try to find a used copy of it. And then there are books that are hard to find today, but still in print, like Bucky Works, that are kind of an overview of the stages of his developmental work, how he developed modular homes, modular cars, developed the geodesic dome, all these things out of his ideas. So all of these ideas with structure and form are directly applicable. So the tetrahedron is the minimum form to enclose space, and one thing that Bucky discusses about it is that all other forms relate back to the tetrahedron. The tetrahedron is the minimal form not just to enclose 3D space, but the minimal form of structure in the world to begin with. It is the essential form. Again, related to fire. And when we talk about the different elements, we can also think in terms of the way the elements are dealt with in what's called hermetic analogy. Hermetic analogy is simply making an analogy between things using the hermetic principle of as above, so below. And so hermetic analogy applies to the principle of the elements in the world, earth, air, fire, and water, and how they relate to subtle bodies of the human being. So in the fourfold model that we discussed before, the human physical body would of course relate to the element of earth. The human etheric body of life energy is classically connected to the element of water. And so the idea of, it's like you're moving through water, and some forms of Qigong they talk about like you're swimming in air when you're working with the Qi energy, with the etheric energy. So water and etheric or life energy. The astral is related to air. In other words, consciousness functions related to air. And then fire is related to self-awareness, or the spiritual core of the human being, the I am presence. That's why in the Old Testament, when Moses finds the burning bush and asks who it is, it says, I am the I am, with the burning bush. And with the descent of the dove of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost, there's the flame emerging at the platform of energy above the head. All of these things have to do with the relationship of fire to the human spirit. With the analogy taken further, in the deeper Kabbalistic works, that the human I am presence, or our self-awareness, is like a flame from the ocean of fire that is the consciousness of the Godhead. We have a detachment of a part of the Godhead in ourselves that is our spiritual core. And that, in the vast majority of the spiritual traditions that teach reincarnation, which is the majority of the human race over time, teaches that that's the part of us that can reincarnate, the spiritual core. Not all of the lower personality is what is permanent, but rather that spiritual core is what is permanent. And it's interesting to note that even for those Western traditions that do not teach reincarnation, because most of the Eastern teachings all do, but for those Western teachings that in their external form do not teach reincarnation, almost all of the esoteric branches of those traditions do teach reincarnation. So when I work with Sufi groups, although Islam does not teach reincarnation, the Sufis understand and teach reincarnation as an esoteric branch of Islam. Although today in conservative or fundamentalist Christianity, there is no understanding or acceptance of reincarnation. In esoteric Christianity, there's always been an understanding of reincarnation, going back all the way to the statement in the New Testament, where the disciples are asking Jesus about the being of Elijah. And there's a statement that they come to understand from the responses that Jesus gives them, that Elijah had returned as John. Then we have in Judaism, once again, this idea that in the esoteric, or the exoteric, outer part of Judaism, they say there is no reincarnation. But if you work with Kabbalistic rabbis, they all understand reincarnation. In fact, there's one book that we have out here that's called Beyond the Ashes. And it's actually the story of a Jewish Kabbalistic rabbi who makes it his life's work to find the current reincarnations of Jews who died in the Holocaust. And so this is something that's well understood in Jewish Kabbalistic circles. In fact, I'm even aware of statements by Jesuits and other people high up in the Catholic hierarchy. There's one particular story where a student of Steiner's, and of course as a Rosicrucian there's an understanding of reincarnation in that tradition, was visiting a Jesuit. And the Jesuit's office was full of books by Rudolf Steiner, which is not accepted by the Catholic Church. And so he asked, well, as a Jesuit, why do you have all of these books by Steiner? He said, no, he talks about reincarnation, but that's not accepted Catholic dogma. And the Jesuit just shrugged and said, well, we all know it's true, but it's just not for the public. And so this is the kind of thing that the more you look into it, all the esoteric branches talk about this aspect of reincarnation. So within the esoteric tradition, this aspect of fire is related to self-awareness and to the human spiritual core. Then the octahedron, as we mentioned, air, the astral body. And so as we work with these different shapes, we are dealing not only with the forces of nature, but also with aspects of the structure of the human being at different levels. Now again, in many circles, the attribution of the elements to the shapes is often something that's treated very abstract and philosophically. But it's really not abstract at all. It's very directly related to the manifestation process. When you see that the form of the cube is related to Earth, and then all the phenomena that's related to the actual crystallization process, there's a reason why salt, one of the three primary substances that are used in classical alchemy, that the salt comes in the form of a cube, a pure cubic form. And we find phenomena in biogeometry, for example, where that 90-degree angle, like you get on the surface of a cube, will actually give you this spiritual carrier wave function from the shape-caused wave of the angle. A lot of interconnected phenomena. We also have at this point also mentioned that the icosahedron related to water is the pure form of viruses. The protein code on viruses has an icosahedral form, and that's one reason why they are difficult to break. There are particular aspects of structure that are actually related to all the things that we are doing in medicine, such as the lock and key mechanisms in biology. So again, we have the four basic forms: tetrahedron for fire, octahedron for air, cube for earth, icosahedron for water, that are related to the four elements. And then the dodecahedron is related to the ether, the universal life force. And we mentioned before that for the ancient Greeks, the four primary forms were allowed to be released publicly, but the fifth form was hidden, and you could not talk about it publicly if you had been initiated into knowing about this form in the Pythagorean school. Now again, we should also bear in mind that all of these forms come about. Why we call them the 5 perfect forms is because if you were to take the surface of a sphere and draw lines on the sphere itself, because the sphere is the first letter of the divine alphabet, if I'm going to then start differentiating the sphere into points and lines and faces, there's only 5 perfect ways that I can divide it that will give me all faces that are the exact same shape, all the angles are exactly the same, etc., etc. And there's more written about this in your handout. So be aware that these come from the perfect divisions of a sphere. Now there's an aspect of this that I want to bring out that's related to what I call the 3-4-5 harmonic. Now we had mentioned this in passing before. There are particular types of coding systems in nature that we need to learn to recognize because it's related to a lot of different phenomena. We talked before about the Kabbalistic teaching about the 1, 3, 7, 12, and how those numbers, often treated as holy numbers in multiple traditions, but treated very abstractly in the public work, are actually related to the coding system of anchor points in the human physical and energy body for the construction of the different layers of the subtle body. The 3-4-5 is related to what we discussed before, where if we're going to create a form that with straight lines can enclose space, then the minimal form I can create is a triangle with 3 points and 3 lines. So that's the minimal form to enclose 2-dimensional space. And as we mentioned, if I add 1 point above it and connect it up, then I get the minimal form to enclose 3-dimensional space, the tetrahedron. But in 2-dimensional space, basic form is the triangle. Then what comes next, of course, with the 4 is the form of the square. Then with the 5 gives me the form of a pentagon, or of course the form of a 5-pointed star. And the 3-4-5 then becomes the foundation of structure to enclose space, to hold something inside of it. Because once we get past the 5, before 3, we can't enclose the space with straight lines. After the 5, we can enclose the space by using a combination of the previous numbers and shapes. So I can create a hexagon with 2 triangles, for instance. I can create 7 with a combination of the triangle and the square. I can do the 8 with 2 squares, etc., etc. So everything later comes as a combination of these forms. So the 3-4-5 are fundamental. Now if you take a look at the forms that are in front of you, you'll see that several of these forms have triangular faces, and that one form has a square face and one form has a pentagonal face. So that the way it comes down is that the form of the tetrahedron, the octahedron, the icosahedron all have triangular faces. 4 triangular faces for the tetrahedron, 8 for the octahedron, and that's what all the names really mean. So you hear tetrahedron, it simply means 4 faces. So there are some terms we should be familiar with, and the suffix gon basically means an enclosing form. So a polygon means basically many sides, or an octagon means an 8-sided structure, or a hexagon is a 6-sided structure. So a gon is basically related to sides and these types of shapes, whereas a gram is like a hexagram or a pentagram, and that's a star-shaped form. So a 5-pointed star is a pentagram, which is held within the enclosing 5-sided form, which is a pentagon. So gon is the sides, gram is the points on a star. Then we have the term hedra, and that has to do with faces. So the term polyhedra means simply many faces. So all the forms you've created are polyhedra. They have many faces. So following this classical terminology that we always use in sacred geometry, a dodecahedron has 12 faces. That's what dodeca means. And a tetrahedron has 4 faces. An octahedron has 8 faces. So it's nothing other than telling you the actual form of the shape we're working with in another language. Now there's another thing that's embedded in this. Before I get to that, let me say one other thing. There is something else beyond that, but beyond the working with the gon and the gram and the hedra, there's also the tope. So that there's a term polytope. So a polyhedra means many faces. All of these things you build are polyhedra. A polytope is a higher dimensional form. So if you had a fourth dimensional cube, that would be one of the polytopes. And there's a text that we had out here by HMS Coxeter, who's one of the famous people in recent history that has worked with the dynamics of higher dimensional forms. It's called Regular Polytopes. It's probably kind of the Bible of higher dimensional forms. There's also, as a side note here, an interesting book that just came out about HMS Coxeter that's called The King of Infinite Space. And it's kind of a conversational memoir of this guy, HMS Coxeter. And he didn't get into the mystical side at all of these forms. He was fairly materialistic. But he really did incredible work about the dynamics of shapes, and particularly in elaborating what the actual forms and structures of higher dimensional forms would be. And he created all types of amazing diagrams and things of showing projections into 2 dimensions or 3 dimensions of higher dimensional forms. And one thing that HMS Coxeter did that's quite remarkable is that something happened to math back around the 1970s. Was the introduction of something called the new math. And the new math was something inflicted on people like me going through school, which led to many of us having a tremendous aversion to mathematics in general. And so there's a whole generation of people that were inflicted with the new math that have tremendous aversion to math because of it. We have this math trauma. We weren't allowed to access it in a way that made any sense to us. If I'd been allowed to play with shapes, hey, that would have been great, I get it. Okay, nature uses this, nature uses that, super. But instead, the new math was based on the principle of get rid of all geometry. Don't let them see anything. Work only with pure abstract numbers that they can't relate to, and give it to them at a real young age before they can even think in those terms. And so they did a lot of work to get rid of the geometry aspect. So in The King of Infinite Space, they describe the story of how HMS Coxeter was like the knight riding into battle defending geometry, and how he, in a sense, saved modern geometry. And in the end, he won, and a lot of the new math things started to fall apart because nobody could do math anymore. And so they started to bring the visual part and the geometry back in. So a little side note there. Also, it's one of the few texts that you'll find that has critical comments to say about Bucky Fuller. So, you know, for the gossipy side of things, it's got some of that too. Well, on the whole, I really like Bucky Fuller. So that's why most of the stuff about him is really laudatory. He was very visionary. So going back to our topic here, you have triangular faces, you have square face, and you have a pentagonal face. So that's the 3, 4, 5. For the perfect forms, perfect divisions of a sphere, it comes back to our 3, 4, 5 harmonic. But there's also the aspect of this that has to do with how the 3, 4, 5 harmonic manifests in another way. And I'll get to that just shortly because it's a little bit more complex. But at this point, the 3, 4, 5 relates to the triangular, square, and pentagonal faces. Now, as far as the history of the Platonic solids, we call them Platonic solids because they go back in history to the time that Plato was giving out his writings, and he was teaching certain things he learned in the Pythagorean mystery school. Pythagoras had trained in the Egyptian temples, also trained in Babylon, and so he was teaching these initiates all about geometry. And one of the Pythagorean principles that he had picked up from these other schools in the Middle East was that initiation is impossible without a knowledge of geometry. And so that's one of the core concepts in their school, that you cannot have spiritual initiation without a knowledge of geometry. And from my perspective, part of that is because, number one, it gives you the pattern and the structure to know how things work. But it also, from my perspective, is giving you the actual language of higher beings and higher worlds, which is why so much meditative material in different traditions is purely geometric. So what you see, for example, with the Hindu yantras or the Tibetan mandalas, it's a pure shape form for meditation of the structure of higher worlds. So we associate the Platonic solids because they were given out to modern knowledge according to the works of Plato. But we know that the knowledge of these forms go back much further, so that Professor Keith Critchlow, one of the great modern avatars of sacred geometry, particularly in architecture, who teaches sacred geometry in terms of architecture in Britain, and has written a number of books, and is really one of the most prominent advocates of the old masters of the compass tradition. And he actually trained people like Robert Lawler, who have also written books on sacred geometry. He wrote a text called Time Stands Still, which is currently out of print, but is coming back into print later next year. Time Stands Still is his study of Celtic sacred geometry and the sacred geometry of the stone circles of Britain. But also, because he is British, and he's done a lot of investigation for how they used it in classical times in Britain, he also discovered that there are all of these stones that come from the region that is currently primarily Scotland. Some a little further south, but primarily what is currently Scotland in the British Isles. All these places that you see up here in Scotland that have these circles on them are places where these particular types of stones have been found. So there are a lot of these things to be found, and these things have been dated to at least 3,500 years ago, and some people say that they are much older than that. So they certainly predate the teachings of the Greeks, and again, they might go back much, much further. So these particular stones that you see illustrated here, they're illustrated in Keith Critchlow's book, Time Stands Still, along with their locations. And what you see is that basically they are stones that are shaped in such a way that where there is a vertex or a corner, a vertex is a technical name for the corner of the form, you have a bump or a projection on the form, and then they have an empty space between them where you could put a string or a cord to define the shape of the faces. So we know that these shapes were known and used in some type of application in the British Isles long before the Greeks came about. This is a close-up of one of the forms. This is a tetrahedron. And this is also related to what you would find if in some more advanced forms of sacred geometry, there's things we sometimes do where we get an actual sphere, and then there are these compasses that are specialized to draw on the surface of a sphere. They actually fit on the sphere, and you can make what's called great circle lines on the sphere. That's what you see here. Every one of these lines on the Genisa here is a great circle line, creating an encompassing circle on one part of a sphere, and it's called a great circle because it encompasses the largest part of the sphere, the widest part. If you moved, let's say, the orange line further into some direction, it would be of a narrower expanse because now it's covering less of the sphere. The great circles are at different axes, but they're all covering the widest extent possible of the sphere. So with these forms, they have more of that spherical aspect to them. Instead of a pointed face, they have these more circular faces. And sometimes they are beautifully worked, like this particular example, which has these beautiful counter-rotating spirals etched all over it. And there are different theories and different groups about what these were used for. I believe they were used for initiation purposes in Britain at that time. Some of the more materialistic commenters say that they were used for something having to do with stone weights to measure things out, but there's no reason for them to be shaped the way that they are for that type of purpose. So again, the way that they are formed, if you look at the form that you see here, which is basically the form that you would get for the corners on an octahedron, then it would form in the form of the stone like this. So this is an early classical form of a Platonic solid, giving you the dynamics of the shape. This particular chart comes from the book Jesus Christ, Son of God, Son spelled S-U-N, that I've referred to before as the best text as an introduction to the Greek gematria. And what it shows is that in this Greek school, there's the understanding that not only did the forms relate to the different elements, they also related to different functions: intuition, thinking, feeling, etc. But again, I want to emphasize the fact they only taught these four forms and not the fifth form, the dodecahedron. And we're going to get to that topic in just a little bit. And this is actually from the work of Johannes Kepler, where he then illustrated the Platonic solids so that they actually showed the elements inside of them. So you see the earth and the tree inside the cube, and you see the water with the icosahedron, the fire and the tetrahedron, etc. And it's Kepler's work that we often refer to as illustrating the harmony of the spheres, the way that there is a mathematical structuring related to pure sacred geometry that we also talked about in the beginning on Saturday when we showed illustrations from a little book of coincidence, and these amazing geometric relationships in the way that the planets are spaced out and their orbital rhythms and all these things that are are really incredible, particularly when you understand that many of them are at 99.9% accuracy according to a pure geometric form. And so Kepler's form was to nest Platonic solids inside one another and related their structural dynamics when they were nested like that to their actual orbital placement out in the heavens, which is what you see here. And actually his work was fairly accurate. Now again, the technical names for this is that we call the corner a vertex. And so we'll talk about a vertex, or of course the plural of this is vertices. So if we talk about vertices, we're just talking about the corners on the form. And then you have, of course, the edges on the form. There's a certain number of edges on every form, which was the number of sticks you needed to build the form. And then, of course, we have the number of faces on the form. Now, this is also related to our progression in dimensions that we talked about before. So we talked about in 0 dimensions we have a point. In 1 dimension we have a line. In 2 dimensions we have a plane. And so the point with the 0 dimensions are the points or vertices on the form. The lines are the edges on the form. The faces are the planes on the form. So points, lines, and planes for 0, 1, and 2 dimensions. And so all of these come together. It's like these are the dimensions then manifesting themselves to bring the overall structure of the 3-dimensional form to enclosed space. We've talked about the masters of the net tradition, and interestingly enough, today we use the term the net, and I often use the term Platonic nets, to describe the way that you could take apart any of these forms and lay them flat. And then if you were to then fold up the form, it would create the form of the solid. This is like basic origami. And so these are the forms of the Platonic nets. It's like a cross-shaped form that would fold up to make a cube. We've already worked with that form of the triangle subdivided into 4 triangles that you saw in the work with the Vesica. And then these are the forms for the octahedron, dodecahedron, icosahedron. So this is something you'll also be exposed to in sacred geometry, is the idea of 2-dimensional nets that if folded up would make the actual structure of the 3-dimensional form. We mentioned the other day about this idea of the thought form in the mind of God behind these perfect forms, behind these archetypal geometric shapes. And so let's go through the different Platonic solids one at a time, and I'll give you a few highlights of some of the esoteric and real-world scientific aspects of these particular forms. So of course we start with the tetrahedron. Tetrahedron is the core form. And so the tetrahedron, as we mentioned, is the minimal form to enclosed space as we go through dimensional structure. So that whereas the triangle is the minimal form to enclosed space with straight lines in 2 dimensions, you had a point at the top, and then you connect it up, and you then have the tetrahedron, minimal forms for 3 dimensions. And before we discussed the way that the base is considered spiritually to be connected to the principle of the Trinity, because the Trinity creates balance within a polarity. One of our Vesica concepts is that the Vesica between the 2 polar circles that create the Vesica is like a perfect balance. It's almost like a third element between the 2 polar circles. And so within most classical traditions, there's this idea of the Trinity. So it's not just the Trinity in Christianity. There's very prominent trinities in ancient Egypt. In fact, all the major mystery centers had particular trinities of gods that they worked with, actually trinities of netters. And then there are 3-fold or triune gods in Hinduism and other traditions. This is from one of the works of Mantak-Chia, and it demonstrates the principle of having 3 elements at a base, and then creating a joint structure at the top that connects to all of them. And this is related to the way that 3 people can work to create a type of joint energetic form that then connects to higher worlds. And this is the type of work that I've been exposed to in multiple small closed groups in different parts of the world that do things of this nature, because there are many advanced spiritual principles that we haven't really discussed in this course, but some of you might be aware of, that then connects to sacred geometry, where people will work together and will become the foundation for a higher form, according to even their placement within a room for particular types of energetics to take place. So this is one idea of some of this work and how it can happen. Without going into all the depths of the dynamics of this type of work, I will make one comment that within esoteric work, there's the understanding that whereas the mind of God creates these archetypal thought forms that create the geometric structure that's the blueprint for all the beings and levels of creation that come after, that because the mind of God, the essence of God, is an ocean of fire, because we have a detachment of that ocean of fire with the spark of our divine source, that allows us to also be creative beings. And this leads to the teaching in spiritual traditions about the way that human beings create thought forms, and that these thought forms have a specific type of energetic to them, and that through specific principles, these thought forms can be stabilized, and they can be used for particular purposes. In fact, schools like the Greek Christian Hermetic school of Daskalos that I referred to before, it's one of the first things that you would be taught in the school. And they also do this in the Tibetan school where they talk about the creation of tulpas. It's all related to this aspect of we have the capacity to actually create a type of primordial elemental being through the power of the mind. Normally, our thought and emotional forms will break up after a short period of time, but they can be stabilized through particular processes, and some of those processes have to do with repetition in a particular time cycle, and if they're repeated over a particular time cycle, they will then stabilize. Also, if they're repeated just as a kind of reactive thing in a person's emotional and mental body, where they're constantly creating particular types of thoughts and feelings, even though they don't intend to do it, it will then stabilize that thought form as a type of an entity that then exists in the person's field and continues to draw energy off of the person. It's a self-generated type of form. So this is related to a lot of deeper esoteric work on the intentional work with thought forms for beneficial purposes, and also recognizing stabilized thought forms that are detrimental to find ways to get rid of them. So with that as a basis, and without going into the deeper waters of that, let's just say that there's also the understanding in the classical tradition that there are also thought forms that are fed into by multiple people. One of the classical terms for this type of group thought form is an egregore. The egregore deals with the way that people, through using their joint mind and emotional energy, can create a mass elemental that has a particular energetic to it. And this can be either something that's done intentionally in spiritual circles, hopefully for beneficial purposes, or it can be something that coalesces as something quite detrimental, particularly in very negative political or social movements. Like with Nazism or something of that kind. There were great egregores, mass thought forms that were developed that were quite detrimental. So from that perspective, this is also related to this type of work, that people working together can create this type of joint elemental or joint thought form that has a type of independent identity. But because this is a very deep topic in itself, we'll have to leave it at that, just making the connection to using geometric forms as a structure for the basis of creating this. Let's also tie it into the work that we described with gematria, the way that there's a correspondence between letters and numbers in the Greek language, the Hebrew language, Sanskrit, and other so-called holy alphabets. So I just want to point out a couple of quick items with it. One is that in the Greek work, the tetrahedron was related to the cube in a particular way, to where the tetrahedron in its side length and its volume was related in the numbers connected to that to the cube in such a way that in relation to the volume of the tetrahedron and the volume of the cube, that the tetrahedron gave you 1179, which means the first mystery, and also relates to alpha, alpha as the beginning. And the cube is omega, omega as the end. And 849 gives you omega, or the macrocosm. There is this idea that the cube is related to a culmination process, and the cube is also related to what's known as the philosopher's stone in classical alchemy. And if you look at what's called the 7 apocalyptic seals, used in some Christian esoteric groups, in the final seal, with the final stage of revelation, there is a movement of energies around the form of a cube that leads to a transmutation that's called, in the book of Revelation, the creation of the New Jerusalem. The creation of the New Jerusalem is an actual transmutation of the form of the planet Earth into its next evolutionary state. Here, from the Greek gematria, it shows a relationship between a tetrahedron and a sphere that is enclosed inside of it. so that when you compare the volume or the radius or the diameter in particular systems of the two together, it gives you values connected to some of the netters that were worked with, these divine forces and principles. So Zeus, Hermes, and also Apollo being connected to the force of the sun, and later taking form in the Christian mysteries as the solar logos. Because Apollo comes from apolos in Greek, which means not many, or in other words, meaning one, related to the one, and how the sun is related to the one of the Godhead. The sun is the of S-U-N, which in the Christian mysteries becomes S-O-N of the Son of God, is also related to the way that the sun in the sky is the revelation of the nature of the Godhead within the local solar system. Everything moves around it. It is the center point, and it radiates the light and the warmth that gives life to everything within the local system. Interestingly enough, at one particular part of the system, it also gives you the gematria for the net. Again, this is from Jesus Christ's Son, S-U-N of God. These charts are very important, and they come from the first volume of Bucky Furler's Synergetics. And again, Synergetics is like a master Bible of structure. So Bucky Fuller was working with all the different dynamics of the core shapes. And there's things you'll find in Synergetics that you just won't find anywhere else. Things that Bucky Fuller figured out. I heard a story one time, which I hope is not apocryphal, but the person swears it is true, where Bucky Fuller was giving a talk to a group of students connected to Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. And so Fuller, when he would talk, would go on this incredible dialogue that if you've ever heard recordings of him speaking are just remarkable. So there are audio tapes and there are videotapes of him speaking. And they're well worth listening to because the man is just, he's downloading. It's just an incredible download. And so he goes off on this whole thing about the structures of creation, et cetera, and at the end people are sort of stunned. And Maharishi Mahesh Yogi nods his head and says, yes, this man really sees these things. And that's very true. When you look at the way that he spoke about it and the things that he wrote about, they become extremely cosmological. They become extremely a matter of direct spiritual vision of what's happening here. He wouldn't necessarily say it in those terms. Bucky used his own particular idiosyncratic language for everything, but it's pretty obvious when you look at it that he's getting direct perception of how all these forms work at a very deep level. But he's not doing it as a pure visionary experience. He's also working with all the pure math and form of it. So what he shows here, and there's a lot of embedded stuff here, but there's just one thing I want to bring out, and that is that he shows that if you look at the sum of the angles around every vertex, in other words, the angles created around every point on the different shapes, that when you begin to work with the numbers created by it, that they all are connected to the number for the tetrahedron, which is 720 degrees, because there's 3 60-degree angles around every one of the points on the tetrahedron, which gives you 180 degrees. Then there's 4 points, so that's 180 degrees for the 3 angles around each point, times 4, which gives you 720. So the 720 degrees, then you find multiples of that number for all the other forms. 1440 for the octahedron, then you go up through the cube, icosahedron, dodecahedron, and the form that he called the vector equilibrium, which is what we've described before as the classical name of the cube octahedron. Now there's a very important principle here with the 720. Now one of these is that if 720 is the base number, what he shows is that the tetrahedron at 720 is the base form. So 720 degrees gives you 1 tetrahedron. The octahedron at 1440 gives you 2 tetrahedra. Then the form of the cube at 2160 divided by 720 gives you the equivalent of 3 tetrahedra. Icosahedron is the equivalent of 5 tetrahedra. Rhombic dodeca, that we'll work with later, is 6 tetrahedra. Dodecahedron relates to 9 tetrahedra. In other words, the sum number of the angles on every one of the form relate directly to multiples of the 720, the primal aspect of which is the tetrahedron. They're all developments from the tetrahedron as a core form in a particular harmonic series. And there's many esoteric things connected to the numbers here. Everything from particular numbers of years in a human lifespan, to the number of years to move 1 degree in the precession of the equinox, where we see the constellations in the heaven according to the movement of celestial dynamics. A lot of things, many of which I have written up for you in your handout, and not all of which we're going to take the time to bring out here. But it's important to understand this chart. And for those of you that are interested in many of these deeper relationships, again, it's very worthwhile looking this up in synergetics. So what's this 72 thing? Well, in harmonic numbers, it's well understood that the zeros don't count. Just ignore the zeros. So 720 is the same thing as 72. All through gematria, you find this same principle. They drop the zeros and you just get the pure numbers. In fact, 0 didn't even exist in some of the concepts of some older traditions. So it's just the pure number. Drop any zeros and you get the core number. So 720 gives us 72. And interestingly enough, what would be the essence of the number 72? And for that, we can go to the Jewish Kabbalah. There's a form that the Greeks used that's called the tetractus. And it shows the way that you can have 1, and then 2, and then 3, and then 4, and it'll give you the form of a triangle. And they also show the way that that gives you the total of the number 10, which is a kind of a perfect number, a sum in and of itself. This form is then connected to a particular application of the Jewish Kabbalah at a deep level, in which that also gives you a matrix for creating step by step the parts of the divine name Yod He Vav He. So the 1 becomes the first letter, the Yod, then Yod He Vav, Yod He Vav He. And every one of these layers or levels is connected, of course, to the gematria of that particular letter, which gives you a number. So the first layer for the Yod, it gives you 10. Then for the Yod He, it's 5 plus 10 for 15. Yod He Vav is 6 plus 5 plus 10, which is 21. And then Yod He Vav He gives you the total of 26. Add it all up together, the total sum number in gematria for this form of the divine name of God as it manifests through the levels gives you the total of 72. And so the great name of God has a gematria in the Jewish Kabbalah of 72, which connects us directly to that core harmonic for the construction of the perfect three-dimensional shapes in the phenomenal world and the essence of the tetrahedron, which is itself fire. Now, there's very important aspects of the tetrahedron. Again, when you study synergetics or Fuller's work, he is just constantly going into the significant aspects of the tetrahedron and pulling out one remarkable observation after another, many of which, again, other people had not observed. So part of it has to do with the way that the tetrahedra is related to creating a stable structure in space. If you're going to immobilize or stabilize something in space. So if you have just a ball, as shows with the arrows here, the ball can roll in any direction. But if you have two balls that are linked up together, then they have to roll in a type of coordination with each other. So they can both roll out from the center, or they can roll in toward the center together. Then with the three, there's something similar happening there in the way that they can move. If you want to lock it into place, though, you have to have four balls, with the fourth ball added, which gives you the four nodal points of a tetrahedron. Then the whole system locks into place and cannot rotate. So the tetrahedron is also the minimal form to stabilize, in this case, the spheres, so that they're stabilized in space in the tetrahedral structure. Now, he has another illustration of the same concept, which relates to ways that this can be used in design, architecture, etc., and was used by Fuller in multiple ways. It's related to a concept he called tensegrity, where something could be suspended from multiple nodal points, and there's a particular formula according to the number of nodal points by which it has to be suspended from to be completely immobilized. And the basic idea here is that we could use something like a pendulum. We have a weight on a string, and again, if you just have one anchor point, like you're holding a pendulum, you can pretty much move it any way you want to. But if it has two anchor points, then what the sphere can do, the ball can do, is it can move and spin around in a plane. Then if you add a third anchor point, then it can kind of move back and forth in a line. But once you come to the point of adding the fourth anchor point, then it is immobilized into place. and the most it can do is a small amount of ratcheting. And so the minimal form to immobilize the form in space is to sustain it at 4 anchor points. The 4 anchor points will hold it into its spatial position. And again, if we think of this as a thought form in the mind of God, this has to do with how you create forms in space that will be stabilized at a core level. This is then extrapolated to a system that Fuller called tensegrity, where things can be suspended from certain numbers of nodal points. And we have, for instance, a model here related to the form of an octahedron that shows you how tensegrity structures work. They become a stable structure even though the actual chords that it works with are flexible. And it's what he calls a tension compression structure. And it's a little more detail than we can get into here, but it's described in great detail in Fuller's works. And it's a very important structural design principle. Now there's the aspect as well of the tetrahedron that is quite remarkable, which is that if you look at another way, if you begin to break down the way that the lines operate on a tetrahedron, there are 6 lines on a tetrahedron. You have to have 6 little sticks to make your tetrahedron model. Bucky breaks that up into 2 trinities. In other words, 2 sets of 3 lines that can move independent to each other but that are linked. And so he calls this action, reaction, and the resultant for the 3 parts of the 3 lines. So he looks at one as a positive event, one as a negative event, and a type of polarity. So he says one positive event and one negative event together in a stabilized polarized pair equals one tetrahedron, because you can actually then fold the one set of 3 lines like this and the other set of 3 lines like this to give you the outline of the tetrahedron. He has another idea of this which is related to his idea of synergetics and synergy. And we talked about this on the second day of the course. The idea of synergy is where the whole equals more than the sum of the parts. And that's where we showed you that in his analogy related to the way that you could create alloys of metal, where the resulting alloy of metal was much stronger than all of the individual components added together, and that became the foundation not only for modern artillery and armaments, but also for jet aircraft, because before that time you couldn't find a metal that could handle the stresses of the jet engines. So you can get more than you put in through synergy, and that structure is the essence of synergy. That means that Fuller was always saying, don't listen to people who say there's not enough to go around. There is enough to go around of natural resources if you know how to put them together in the right combination. And so one example he gave of this is that from his perspective, that if one set of the 3 lines was 1 and another set of the 3 lines was another 1, if you put the 2 together, they gave the tetrahedron, which equals 4 with the 4 sides, or the 4 points. And so he says this is an example of synergy. 1 plus 1 equals 4, not 2. That you can create the structure out of what seems like it wouldn't come together to create this type of structure. So it was an analogy for this concept of synergy. He took this to deeper levels, and he talked about this as being related to the way that polarized pairs work even in science. And he talked about these then 3-part lines that come together to make the tetrahedron. And he gets into some very deep levels with this. But the upshot is he would say things such as one part of a triple line is related to the electron, the other part to the proton, and then the resultant is the antineutrino. Another one is a positron and a neutron, which gives you a neutrino. And they come together in particular ways. So he began to talk about this in terms of discoveries in modern physics that can be explained according to core shapes and geometries. And then following this, you began to see more use of his ideas in modern science and technology. In fact, particularly in chemistry textbooks, there are a lot of his ideas that have been adopted even for the illustrations, really starting with the work of Linus Pauling. So they've actually adopted quite a few of his concepts for the illustration of the things that they actually see. And as I mentioned to you before, his work is also the foundation for modern nanotechnology. Well, he also goes on to show that these particular sets of lines can be used in particular numbers and combinations to give you the outline for all the Platonic solids, which is a very interesting concept. Again, starting with this 3-fold lines, there's ways you can fold them up to make the cube, the octahedron, the icosahedron, the dodecahedron, all could be formed by these particular trinity events. Again, it's synergy. It's the way that they're put together. And we mentioned before that in his work he showed the way that DNA can be modeled in the actual dynamics of its helix twist on the form of tetrahedra, and the way that one tetrahedra will bond to the other in an ongoing chain will give you, if you actually do it, a particular helical twist that's equal to the helical twist that is observed in DNA. He called this the tetrahelix. And he also showed the way that the photon, the particle of light, that's kind of an essential aspect of creation in physics, is based on the form of a tetrahedron. And he did this particular illustration showing the photon as a tetrahedron. So again, tetrahedron has a core structure in nature. I had mentioned that in chemistry today they're beginning to adapt some of his concepts. And this is from the work General Chemistry by Linus Pauling, and shows the way that if you have systems modeled on two tetrahedra, if two tetrahedra are bonded face to face, what's called a triple bond, because they're connected at 3 points. One base on a tetrahedron is a triangle, so it has 3 points. What they call a triple bond, then, in chemistry, is what gives you the form of a solid. And so when we think of what's the difference between a solid, a liquid, and a gas, where they become more amorphous as they move, it has to do with the way the tetrahedra are bonded together. So two tetrahedra bonded at every point, connecting a face totally, is what's called a triple bond, and it becomes a solid structure. Well, let's break apart the two tetrahedra. So instead they're just connected at a line. They're connected at 2 points on a line of the tetrahedra, and that's given you what you call a double bond, and that gives you the form of a liquid. It now has more freedom of movement according to the way the tetrahedra are connected. Then connect two tetrahedra according to point, and that's what's known in chemistry as a single bond, and that gives you the freedom of movement of a gas. So even the states of nature of solid, liquid, and gas are connected to the way that tetrahedra will bond face to face, line to line, or point to point, creating particular levels of mobility. And elsewhere in general chemistry, they give some illustrations of the way that the tetrahedral form manifests in nature. Interestingly enough, what we know as talc, which is a silicate, has tetrahedra forms in it that actually create 6 tetrahedra in the exact same design as a 6-pointed star. So that's actually the geometric design behind talc. Again, if I had learned this in school, I'd have been much more interested in my math and biology classes. But unfortunately, I didn't get it taught that way. So that's just an overview of some aspects of the tetrahedra, which brings us now to the octahedron. And in just a few minutes we'll break for lunch, but let's go a little bit into the octahedron here. The octahedron, of course, is an 8-sided structure. Every side is a triangle. And I'll give you a revelation right now about the other part of the 3, 4, 5 harmonic, just so I don't forget it later. And that is, if you take a look at your tetrahedron, when we said that there's the 3, 4, 5 aspect in the Platonic solids, that some had triangular faces for the 3, some one square for the 4, and one pentagonal for the 5. There's another 3, 4, 5 that's embedded in it, so if you miss the 3, 4, 5 principle the first time, maybe you'd get it the next time. The exact same way that the Sefer Yetzirah teaches you the 3, 7, 12 harmonic in the text. But in case you didn't get it, they put the 3, 7, 12 harmonic also in the structure of the tree of life, according to the 3 horizontal lines, 7 vertical lines, and 12 diagonal lines in the tree of life. So if you missed the 3, 7, 12 coding information the first time, maybe you'd get it the next time. So in addition to the triangular, square, and pentagonal faces giving you the 3, 4, 5 with the forms, if you take a look at the form of the tetrahedron that you created, you will see that around every one of the points, or the vertices of the tetrahedron, there are connected to it 3 faces. And if you look at the form of the octahedron, then connected to every one of the points, there are 4 faces. And for the icosahedron, for every one of the points, there are 5 faces connected. And so the 3, 4, 5 has now been embedded within the triangular forms of the Platonic solids themselves. So again, if you missed the 3, 4, 5 the first time, you could pick it up again by analyzing the connection of the faces to the points. So there are are 4 faces connected to the points on the octahedron. And the octahedral structure is very important because what it holds is the key to the 3 axes of space. If you look at the form of the octahedron you created, I don't know if you made them according to a scaffolding or not, but one easy way to make an octahedron is simply to put the Zohm toolkits together in such a way that you have one straight line coming down, then another line at 90 degrees, and another line at 90 degrees, so that you have the 3 axes of physical space. If you make that 3-dimensional cross with the Zohm tool sticks, all you got to do is then connect up the points, and you have a perfect octahedron. So the octahedron is basically the form that you get from the 3 axes of physical space. Now that is then connected to some spiritual practices in which we use the form of what I'm going to call from this point on a cubical cross. And I'm calling it a cubical cross because it's a cross at 3 axes, up and down, front and back, and side to side. So a cross on the 3 dimensions, and every one of the crossing points has 90 degrees. This becomes a structure that is used in many traditions to connect to different directions in 3-dimensional space, and also as a protective device to protect the 6 different core directions, because there are 6 points on a octahedron, and those are connected to the 6 primary directions on the 3 axes. In other words, the endpoints of the 3 axes. Now what this means for direct spiritual work is that one will then work on the vertical column of the body and connect to something above and something below. What that something is described as will depend on the tradition. But you connect to something straight up and straight down, and in many cases what you do is you seal those 2 directions with something of a protective nature. And same thing for front and back. That axis, for both points of the front and back axis, you connect to something or you seal it in each direction with a particular thing. Same thing from side to side. It can be connected or it can be sealed with something in particular. So a classical practice in the Christian esoteric tradition is that the 4 directions here on the horizontal are connected to the 4 archangels, Raphael, Michael, Uriel, and Raphael. And then above and below is connected to Christ and to Sophia. But there are variants of this in other traditions. And in particular yogic traditions, they will then connect, of course, to other types of netter forces, depending on what the tradition is. So very important understanding that the octahedron is really the form of the 3 dimensions of space. Now I showed you before a book from the Tibetan tradition that's called Sacred Dimensions of Space and Time by Tarthung Tolku, dealing with the sacred geometry of time. And it talks about a moment of time as past, present, and future. That gives you the form of this triangle. And it then talks about these triangles being connected together in a linear series. And that at depth, these triangles then become what is called in the book the faces of diamonds. But in fact, the forms they illustrate are octahedra, but they're simply, instead of using the technical term, they're simply calling them diamonds. And that these diamonds create a particular structure, so that the structure of time itself is based on the form of the octahedra. Then there are other bodies of work out there. There's a very mixed and problematic body of work related to what's called the Montauk Project. But in some of that mixed work related to the Montauk Project, at one point, they talked about something that they used called a delta T antenna. And delta T means simply a change in time. An antenna form they would use to change time structures. Again, I don't completely recommend this body of work. There's a lot of very problematic aspects in it. But in that particular body of work, they talked about the delta T antenna as something to change time. And the structure of the delta T antenna is a pure octahedron. So interestingly enough, here in the Tibetan tradition, they're talking about the use of the octahedron as the modeling of the formation of time. From the Greek gematria, once again, they knew all about the octahedron. So according to the particular dynamics of it. Now, one way you can look at an octahedra, one of the views of it, is that you can look at it as 3 squares. And those 3 squares are on 3 different 90-degree axes. That's what you see here. That one on the horizontal, this one as the enclosure, and this one on this axis, more vertical. And so the surface area of each internal square will give you 353 related to Hermes. Area of all 3 internal squares, 1061 related to Apollo. And this then leads to the total surface area of the octahedron at these measurements will then equal 1224, which gives you the net. Again, connecting this form of the octahedra to our concept of the net in the Greek esoteric work. Now from general chemistry, aluminum hydroxide crystal is a set of interconnected tetrahedra, as you see here. I'm sorry, of octahedra. Basically octahedra in a hexagonal formation. And crystalline nickel hexamine chloride, again, particular sets of anchor points related to forms of the octahedra. So again, these are particular forms that are actually discovered empirically in the structure of everything in nature, related to the Greek teaching that everything in our world is based on the form of the Platonic solids. Of course, we couldn't show that according to the way modern science can, but modern science is showing you the exact same thing. A periodate ion, again, has the same type of structure. It is a pure form of an octahedron within a sealed structure. And that's what you actually see in the form. And that's actually very similar to the way it had been shown in the ancient times in the pre-Celtic tradition of what is currently Scotland, in the way that they would model it. This then brings us to the form of the cube. The cube, of course, is a very important form, and we've talked about some aspects of it before. Do we know if the lunch is here yet? 5 minutes. Okay, we'll go another 5 minutes. This is one of the type of alchemical paintings or drawings that you would see in several hundred years ago in esoteric texts that illustrate particular concepts. And one of those concepts is the philosopher's stone. And there's many different alchemical aspects of this philosopher's stone concept. But often, in many cases, it would be represented as related to the form of a cube. In some forms of alchemy, one of the secrets of the philosopher's stone is that it is carbon. And carbon, of course, is the foundation for life in this world. But if you look at it at a deeper aspect with the geometries, etc., it leads to a lot of specific applications, both for spiritual alchemy practices and, of course, scientifically. So there we have the philosophers here looking, and they're seeing the stones all around them, and they're seeing the stones of the cubes flying in the air. And so one of the teachings is that the philosopher's stone is all around us, but we do not recognize it. And we mentioned before about the idea, when we talked about the squared circle, of the great black cube at Mecca. And so again, at this particular place, it's one of the primary energy centers for the planet. It's an ancient holy site. And again, it was a sacred site long before Islam, which is only about 1,300, 1,400 years old. So this is a very ancient sacred site, definitely known in ancient Egyptian times and things like that. But in the center of this sacred site, they now have this great cube covered in black. And again, this is part of this whole mystery of the black cube, this whole mystery of manifestation into the physical world. And at a certain point, it's alchemical transmutation to the next stage of human development, which is referred to in the esoteric Christian tradition as the New Jerusalem. But under different names, it's also known in the Islamic tradition and other traditions. Most traditions have some concept of the world to come that they call by their own names. But that world to come comes through a particular alchemical process that involves the activities of human beings. And so one aspect of that is what the Masons would call the royal art. And in your handouts, I have a short thing about the royal art of the Masons. And the deeper aspect of the mystery of the early Masonic royal art is that because the Masons were building structures, they were involved in this process of the sons of Cain. The sons of Cain, rather than the sons of Abel, the sons of Cain are the ones who become the blacksmiths. They become the foundation of agriculture. They actually are working on transmuting the structures of the earth into other structures. That's what a blacksmith does. He takes core elements and then forms it into other structures, creates metallic alloys, etc. And instead of just taking what happens to be growing on a tree as a hunter-gatherer, they become a farmer, and they start actually planting and cultivating the earth and transforming the earth directly. So part of this Masonic mystery, in addition to how do you create a structure that has the correct energetics for spiritual work or to be life energy positive, is this mystery of the royal art. How are we going to transmute the earth to its next state? Which is part of the mystery of how does a human being transmute oneself to a higher state of spiritual development. So the royal art is related to actual structures that are created in Masonic architecture, which are understood to be blueprint patterns for living forms that will be created in the next round of evolution. This gets into the deeper levels of Masonic esotericism, and I have more about this in your handout and in the resource guide, that the structure of a particular cathedral contains within it sacred geometric templates that can actually be applied in the future if it is reduced to a pure blueprint pattern for the creation of living beings in the next round of evolution. So looking at this idea of the cube, there's another aspect of this where the cube is connected to creating a grid in space. And so the grid aspect of a cube, because if you look at what a grid is, it's simply a two-dimensional squared type form. Then that squared will become cubes, cubes upon cubes, creating a grid in space, similar to what we described before with the Behnken cube system. These Earth energy lines that we find all over the planet, identified by the German researcher Anton Behnken, that dowsers now work with and identify the Behnken lines and where they come in, creating a cubical matrix around the surface of the Earth. Where are we at time-wise? Okay. And I also showed you before this particular illustration by Walter Russell, where you have these cubical forms then connected to vortex movements from the center of one plane to the next plane to the next plane within these stabilized cubical grid structures. That's not the way that Russell always describes it. He has other terminology, but from the analysis of the geometry, that's what we're seeing. And also related then to the form of the octahedron, which is referred to quite a bit in Russell's work, either the pyramid or the full form of the octahedron. But again, this movement from one plane or grid of creation to the next in this type of movement. So this actually brings together in Russell's work the idea of the movement in the vortex, the form of the cube as stabilized grids of creation, and the octahedron energies as well. So this is also from the work of Walter Russell, and he says the cube and the sphere are the sole working tools of creation. And he shows the way that you can model the form of a cube coming in by creating what is essentially the 6 directions of the octahedron and bringing in a pyramid on those directions. And then he does something similar with these conical forms, with the conical forms coming in from the 6 directions that are also marked by the nodal points on the octahedron. But his idea is he has many manifestations of this concept that the cube and the sphere are the foundations for all the other forms. And that's connected to our concept of the squared circle, of spirit and matter. One of the very interesting things about the form of the cube itself is that if you created that form of the cube with sticks, and then at the corners, instead of using one of these connector balls that holds it tightly in place, if instead you put a type of flexible rubber connector, then you would find the form of the cube is not that stable. It would flop right over. And if you were then going to use other forms that were connected with flexible rubber at the corners, you would find that the form that would completely stabilize it is 2 tetrahedra, because 2 tetrahedra will perfectly fit within the form of a cube. A cube has 8 corners or vertices. A tetrahedra has 4 corners or vertices. And even with your Zoom toolkit with the correct pieces, you can actually create within the cube the form of a star tetrahedra, which in a very small form and be easier to see in a larger form. And I also created other lines here. You see the form of the star tetrahedron or double tetrahedron stabilizing the cube. So this is much stronger than it would be without the tetrahedra stabilizing it inside. So this question of the star tetrahedra as an aspect of the human astral body is then also connected to this form of the cube. So in physical space, the double tetrahedra, the star tetrahedra, is the structural form that stabilizes the cube itself. And the two really fit together. Now there are empty spaces created that would actually then be filled by octahedra. And the octahedra would then extend from one cube to the next cube. And this becomes a matrix in space. And we'll talk a little bit more about that matrix a little bit later. But this concept is very important, this idea that the tetrahedra is the basic form of stability. And in Bucky Fuller's work, he showed how we need to use the tetrahedron as a basic structural building block to stabilize cubical structures. And then esoterically, this is a relationship between the star tetrahedral structure of the astral body and how it fits into and relates to, in a particular way, to the human physical body, the cubical structure of manifest creation. So all of these things are interconnected. This is the actual Platonic net of the cube. And as you see, if you take a cube apart by cutting it at its seams, it would fold out to actually make the form of a cross. And in fact, there are deeper stories in esoteric Christianity that have to do with the relationship of the cross to the cube, including the relationship of the cross to the black cube's opening. There's a lot of very deep esotericism with the relationship of cube and unfolded to the cross. And one of those aspects has to do with that form of the star tetrahedron, which fit inside the cube. And then as the cube opens up to be the cross with the star tetrahedron on it, it's sometimes referred to in esoteric work as the crown of thorns. The crown of thorns then connected to the cross, and the thorns, of course, with the corners of the star tetra. There's a particular body of work that was in a very hard to find document, a book that was published many years ago called Fundamental Structure. And Fundamental Structure basically took blood samples from different mammals and put it in a particular substance. They put it in sausage skin and particular types of substances inside of it, and they saw it crystallize out into three-dimensional forms. And what they found is that the form of human blood created different structures than they saw in other animals using the particular elements to crystallize that they used in this system. And the form of human blood crystallized into the form of octahedra and into the form of star tetrahedra. Now the thing to bear in mind about this is that the form of the star tetrahedra can either be seen as being two tetrahedra interpenetrating, or it can be seen as stellating an octahedron. I've talked about this several times so far, but now that you're building the forms, hopefully it'll all be clearer to you. If you look at an octahedra, and you would then to create a point above the top of every one of the center of the 8 faces on the octahedra. In other words, it's like you made a little tetrahedron on the top of all the 8 faces of the octahedra. That would give you a form of a star tetrahedron. And so there's a relationship here to why they're finding that the blood crystallizes to either an octahedral form or a star tetrahedra, because the octahedra is one matrix on which the star tetrahedra is created. Next. Now, an interesting thing about the star tetrahedra is that there's some work by Buckminster Fuller looking at this form as well. And what he shows is that if you look at the form of the star tetrahedra and you take apart, he has the arrows here, they start here, you take apart the 2 tetrahedra. So now the 2 tetrahedra have been taken apart. Then you break it open so that now you have simply the 4 triangles of each tetrahedra. And then he shows the way that these can be reconnected in particular ways to create other forms, such as the form of an octahedra and other things. In fact, there's a lot of stuff like this in Bucky Fuller's work, where he shows how forms, according to their dynamics, can be taken apart and reconstructed in a type of alchemy to create other component forms. This is from Walter Russell, a very interesting idea that he had. He said, nature's method of creating power is gravity amplifying compression cubes. Now this is connected to something we haven't talked about because it's fairly detailed in Russell's work, which is what he calls the 9 octaves of the elements. In Russell's version of the periodic table of elements, which I showed you is based on the form of a spiral or a vortex, he has multiple octaves of energy that are discoverable within the elements that make up our world. And this is described both in books that talk about Russell's work, but also in the book called Minerals for the Genetic Code that I've recommended a few times in this course, which is a remarkable work. And so he's got his drawing here showing nature's method of creating power by this compression of the cubes together. And what would you expect a solid form like the cube to create? It's the actual atomic arrangement of iron. Iron is based on this kind of cubical structure, as is salt. And of course, iron is one of the primordial base things that we find in the world that is extremely strong. And of course, many of our later alloys that came later were alloys of other metals with iron to be something very strong. is one of the first steps in human evolution to creating alloys and very strong metallic structures. Now, there's a carbide of iron called martensite that's related to the form of a cube connected to the form of an octahedron. Also, for those of you that have studied things related to anions and cations, which is found, for instance, with Acres USA work in holistic agriculture, because without going into the depths of this, there's a process called ionization in which things are given an electrical charge. This is a very important principle. It's described, again, one text I can think of off the top of my head is genetics, minerals for the genetic code. And this electrical charge that's applied to substances is very, very important, the electrification of matter, because then those charges work together in a particular way. But the upshot of it is that the anions around a central cation with these particular types of charges take these classical forms of the triangle, the tetrahedron, the octahedron, and the cube. So again, these are literal building blocks for how everything comes together. Silicon tetrafluoride is based on the form of a cube, and then at the corners connected to the form of a tetrahedron. So literally nature's building blocks for structure. Now, Rosslyn Chapel, many of you are familiar with, and I was fortunate enough that myself and Elizabeth were able to go there this summer. In fact, we went there with Bethany, who's also here on some of the days of this course. And the downside of the Da Vinci Code is that it's greatly popularized places like Rosslyn Chapel, so it's hard to get in there without having a huge crush of people screaming and flailing all around you. But it's still a remarkable place. And of course, there's a lot of text out today talking about its connection to the Knights Templars and the Masons and all these things. I want to point out one part of its structure. Again, it's really an incredible geometry of the place. Well, one part is that if you look up at the ceiling, it's got these 5-pointed star structures that I talked about yesterday in connection to the Egyptian mysteries. But in many parts of Rosslyn Chapel, they have these arches, and the arches have these projected cubes coming off of them. They're all over the place. There's a lot of these different cubes, and they have particular designs on the different faces. I'll give you a close-up of it. So this is what you see with the arches, and here's the cubes coming off in a particular regular pattern. And this is a close-up of some of the cubes. So they have different designs that are imprinted on them, different geometric designs for different archways within the overall structure. And there's been the thought that there's some type of geometric information encoded on the cubes, and that needs to be solved. At one point, people related to the chapel said that they had taken photographs of every face of every cube, and that they would make that available to interested people that want to do analysis. We contacted them and asked to get copies of the faces of the cubes, but we never got a reply, unfortunately. But that's something I'd be very interested in. So it might be some type of geometric information encoded at Rosslyn Chapel on these cubes. Certainly the people that engraved it knew a lot about Masonic architecture and classical ideas. It could also be connected to the actual energetic emanations coming from the cubes when we talk about the shape-caused wave or the geometric resonance. There could be something in the way that they're carved that creates a particular energy emanation within the location, which is quite a discussion in itself. With my being there and checking out the geometries, it's a space that is what I would call microstructured into multiple resonances all through the structure. It's just got a tremendous layer upon layer upon layer of geometric energetic structuring. And this is probably one part of it. Now, I mentioned before about Bucky Fuller's work with nanotechnology. And so I threw this in because what they're doing today is they've now got to the point in nanotechnology that we can begin to sculpt things at the atomic level. We can actually create molecules now. So I'm getting the wave that's about time for lunch, but let me finish up on this slide. And are there any slides past this one?
50, this is 44, this is 50.
Okay, so we'll finish up here. In fact, let's go ahead and go to lunch right now, and I'll come back and I'll tell you about the formation of molecules and nanotechnology when we will get started. It's probably fine to leave those on, actually, so we have a little bit of light in the room. Yeah, it's fine like this. So where we're at this point is we ended on the issue of nanotechnology and the fact that Buckminster Fuller's analyses of geometric structures related to the development of the nanotechnology field. Again, what nanotechnology is basically creating matter at the molecular level. This means that human beings are becoming creator beings at the molecular level. But when they started to work with nanotechnology, they couldn't get the structures to hold together correctly. So they had to reference the books of Buckminster Fuller to understand how does matter actually come together. And so that's why they give names like Buckminster Fullerene and buckyballs to some of the structures that they create in nanotechnology. This is from Scientific American, showing the way that they are now structuring DNA into three-dimensional structures, in this case related to the form of a cube. So that at this stage they can basically put molecules and DNA into any structure that they like. Now this whole question of nanotechnology is a very interesting one. At this point it's very difficult and time-consuming to build structures with nanotechnology molecule by molecule, but it can be done. The thing that we are moving toward is a time that is probably not in the very distant future where technology is going to be tremendously accelerated on this planet from the development of what's known as a nanotech assembler. What this means is that at this point it's a very painstaking process to molecule by molecule be able to recreate any substance. This means that they can create synthetically virtually any substance under the sun by just putting it together molecule by molecule. In fact, there's already huge initiatives that have moved forward in creating synthetic diamonds that threaten the diamond industry as it currently exists with De Beers in South Africa, because what they had managed to make a scarce resource, although in reality diamonds are not really that scarce, is going to be threatened by these virtually flawless synthetic diamonds that are being made. So the De Beers company is about to gear up a major advertising campaign saying that it's somehow gauche to buy a synthetic diamond because they're going to be so much cheaper than the ones that they mine. But if you take this further, the idea of a nanotech assembler means that instead of doing it painstakingly hand by hand to do true nanotech assemblies, they're going to be able to simply write a computer program and put the computer program into the production machinery. And that means that rather than having to do it themselves, the program will lead the machinery to construct things molecule by molecule. So they'll be able to recreate any substance. So this is going to lead to not only the end of scarcity of some substances, but will also lead to a whole new world of technology. For instance, following this concept, you can create all types of nanotech structures in any type of structure that you create. So that one classical example is that if you have the form of a wall, the wall as it's currently made, if I run into it, I'll hit it hard and then I'll stop. But if it's made according to a nanotech assembly, then you can actually run full speed into the wall and the wall will part at the point of impact. And you will go straight through it and the wall will reform because it actually will be able to be broken at any one of its seams at the point of impact. There's a lot of even wilder stuff that's coming down the pike with nanotech. At this point, nanotech is more of a buzzword than it's a reality, but it is coming fairly quickly. So a lot of stuff uses the term nanotech today that's really not nanotech at all. It's just something that they're using to sell the product. But this is the concept behind nanotechnology. Here's another image of where they are making this type of cubical scaffolding to become an array for DNA cages to create biological macromolecules that could be used for such things as extremely small memory devices. So again, all of this work is already going on. So again, it was through Buckminster Fuller's work that they are learning the language of creation to now create from the atomic structure up. I wanted to throw this in because it was a very interesting illustration. I think this is from Holland, where an architect wanted to create something unusual, so actually had the form of the cubes at these strange angles as part of the construction. I have no idea what it would be like to be inside one of these things at these strange angles, and according to most feng shui analyses, it would be a nightmare energetically. But nonetheless, it's an interesting idea to actually see it built. So this brings us in our analysis of the 5 Platonic solids. We've looked at the form of the tetrahedron, the octahedron, and the cube. And now we come to the icosahedron and the dodecahedron. So depending on how you show one of these things in 2 dimensions, you get different views. So from a point or a vertex first, this is what the icosahedron and dodeca look like. From an edge first, this is what it would look like. And from a face first, then you would get these types of views. And of course, you're now familiar with these structures from having built them. So let's take a look at the icosahedron. This is a photograph of icosahedral dice from ancient Egypt that have been found. So again, we have from multiple cultures the knowledge of these perfect solids. We earlier described the findings from Scotland related to these structures. Now the icosahedron we described before as being related to the element of water. And we had previously shown you this illustration with the way that this virus particle has a pure icosahedral structure. And again, one thing that Buckminster Fuller had commented is that's one reason why it's hard for us to develop antivirals. It has to do with the strength of the protein coat. Now there are other types of infectious organisms too, that again, because they are the simplest forms of life, these basic viral forms, such as certain types of bacteriophages that have the same type of structure. And this is actually the breakdown. It's like pure DNA here with a protein coat that's icosahedral, and then a sheath with an injector to where it can then inject the infectious material into the host organism. And these are actual photographs of these types of organisms with their icosahedral shape of the head. And this shows you that the form of the icosahedron can actually be created by getting the form of 3 golden rectangles. And the 3 golden rectangles would be in the structure that you see here, and they would then connect to the 12 vertices or corners on the form of the icosahedron. So there is a golden section aspect to the icosahedron based on this scaffolding. So while we switch over to the next set of slides, let me go ahead and point out something very important to you related to these forms. And I'm not sure if Jane has talked to you about this in any depth yet or not, but when we're working with these forms, do you have the form of an octahedron?
No, that's too easy.
Okay, let me find where the octahedron got to. Okay. Okay, Jane, did you have them build octahedron?
We didn't get green, so we had to.
Okay, yeah, that's fine, doesn't matter, it has to be green. Okay, get out your octahedron and get out your cube.
Is this it?
Yeah, that's a form of octahedron. Yeah. Did you have them build a standardized, or did everybody build their own type of octahedron?
There are 2 types out there.
Okay. Okay. So what I'd like you to do is get out your octahedron and get out your cube, and you'll see that actually they're in a particular relationship to each other. Now the perfect geometries of these, I think Jane probably explained, that with the limitations of the Zoom toolkit, you can build any of the forms, but to get the geometry exactly right with the angles, the green lines are necessary to build the right shape of the octahedron and the tetrahedron. But in working with this, what you'll find is that there's a particular relationship that's called Platonic duals, and this is extremely important. The Platonic duals describe the way, and also take a look at this with your models, that these are complementary shapes. What this means is that if you look at the form of the cube has 6 faces and 8 corners, whereas the form of the octahedron has 6 corners, has 6 corners and 8 faces. In other words, what's the number of corners on one is the number of faces on the other, and vice versa. So if I take the form of the octahedron and I put it inside my cube, or the other way around, the cube and the octahedra, you'll see that in what would be the center of one of the faces of the octahedra would match a corner of the cube. And where you'd have a corner of the octahedra would match one particular face of the cube. So a perfect match between the complementary relationships of the corners and the center of the faces. This is called a dual relationship. That means that the cube is dual to the octahedron. And if we think of the elements that are involved, the cube is then related to the element of earth, the octahedron to the element of air. And so we have a kind of earth and air complementary polarity that you actually see mirrored in their shape. Again, what is the center of one's face is the corner of the other form. So this concept of the Platonic dual is very important. So what we've come to now is taking a look at the fifth of our Platonic solids, that of the dodecahedron. And remember we said the dodecahedron was the hidden solid, the hidden form from the Greek school. They wouldn't make this one public. And this is a particular diagram created by one of these German scientists following Steiner's work, a man named Paul Schatz. And I don't believe his work is in English at this point. I've just seen his work in German. I actually had a friend in Australia that had translated it just for himself to English. And it describes the way that they had worked with particular types of Platonic geometries. And in this case, they were tracing out the way that the 12 zodiacal signs would actually be imprinted over the faces of a dodecahedron, the 12 signs and the 12 faces. Now there's another aspect of the dodeca where there's an interesting older book called Initiation by Elizabeth Heisch. And the book Initiation, which some of you have probably read, is a really fascinating, supposedly true story about this woman Elizabeth Heisch who begins to have memories of herself in a previous life in Egypt and talks about her initiation experiences in Egypt. It's a very, very good book, Initiation. And among the things she talks about is that in the Egyptian temples in her previous life, she remembered being taught about these Platonic solids. And one of the things that she was taught is this relationship where if you took the form of a cube and you put this type of little four-sided angular house shape on top of the sides of the cube, it would then give you the pentagonal faces. You see how these forms fit together to make these pentagonal faces? It would make the form of a dodecahedron. And then tomorrow we're going to explore in more detail the way that the dodecahedron actually has, with its 12 faces, the capacity to store 5 cubes inside of it. And in fact, the 5 cubes in the dodeca will make a 5-pointed star on every one of the 12 faces of the dodeca. We'll look at that in more detail tomorrow. Xenon hydrate, if you look at its form, it's based on the form of a dodecahedron. Again, one of our core concepts is these patterns manifesting at different scales of creation. So again, modern science, as I claimed to you on the opening weekend, has rediscovered these ancient patterns of creation known to the old spiritual schools and now empirically shown them to be literally at the foundation of matter. Now there's some very important things that the Greeks said about the Platonic solids in general and about the dodecahedron in particular. They said that the Platonic solids are the key to the manifestation of the earth. And what they mean by that at one level is that it's the keys to the manifestation of the physical world. The physical world comes about through the Platonic solids. But at another level, they talked about the dodecahedron specifically is the pattern of the earth as an actual object, that the actual physical earth, the planet Earth, is based on the pattern of a dodecahedron. We'll go into more details about this tomorrow with the Earth grid, but I'll point out one aspect of it today. Now they also would not teach the dodecahedron publicly, as I mentioned before. They said the dodecahedron must be kept hidden. And so in none of the public works from the Pythagoreans will they directly talk about this particular form. Because whereas the other 4 forms are related to the patterns of the 4 elements, the dodecahedron is the key to the ether, which is life force itself. And if that energy was to be misused, then terrible destruction would then result. And what we're going to see is that all of these things are actually true. So one aspect of this is that Platonic solids are the key to the manifestation of Earth. We've seen one part of that already in the way that for all 5 Platonic solids, I've been able to show you from biology, chemistry, physics, etc., that these patterns exist and have been discovered in modern empirical research. So I'm going to show you other aspects of that, plus the pattern of the Earth, and what happens when you misuse patterns like the dodecahedron. So that with the material that we'll be exploring in much more detail tomorrow with the Earth grid, there was research done, beginning with a group of Russian researchers that was published in the early 1970s, where they discovered that the basic form of the Earth's grid and crust was that of a dodecahedron. This was done by a joint group of researchers who were geologists and chemists and physicists and geographers, and they were able to find the particular links for the places on the breaks in the Earth's crust, plus particular locations of energy upwelling on the Earth or magnetic anomaly, etc., that led to them publishing an article which translated into English would be called, "Is the Earth a Giant Crystal?" And so again, what they found was that the basic grid structure of the Earth was based on a dodecahedron. And so what had been one of the teachings in the Greek school, that the form of the Earth is a dodecahedron, and this was only brought out to the public from the Greeks in a writing of Plato's, where he says that the Earth, when seen from above, appears like a 12-sided leather ball. And that was the closest that he would come to actually revealing the secret of the dodecahedron. But now again, in modern research, and it's not just the Russians, but I'll tell you more tomorrow, that American researchers also, including American government agencies, have validated this model of the geometric structure of the Earth. So that what the Greeks said is actually now the case. It is based on a dodecahedral structure. And this is actually part of a larger Earth grid of interconnected energy, a matrix, a web, or what we have been calling the net over the surface of the Earth, that is connected to a series of sacred sites and particular energy effects on the surface of the planet. So again, tomorrow we'll go into this in quite some detail. I just want to connect to it now with that idea of the Greeks having been correct with the dodecahedral structure of the Earth. But we also said that they had warned that we couldn't make it public because if this knowledge of the dodecahedral form was misused, then that access to vital life energy itself, to the ether, could then lead to disastrous consequences. So let's take a look at the periodic table of elements to start with. And this is also going to be connected to this idea that the manifestation of the Earth is connected to the form of the Platonic solids. The periodic table of elements is the literal recipe book for everything that makes up the manifest world. Everything in our world can be reduced to elements on the periodic table. And there are exactly 92 naturally occurring elements on the periodic table. Now, past element number 92, the rest of the elements are man-made elements. They're sometimes called the transuranic elements. They can only be created through what some sources would call a type of black alchemy, in which you create an alchemical retort, a kind of sealed chamber, and you transmute substances such as element number 92, which is uranium, into the further numbers on the periodic table, which become more and more radioactive. And so everything from uranium on up becomes highly radioactive, and that's where you get plutonium, and americium, and berkelium, and all these other types of radioactive elements that have been created in the last 60, 70 years or so. So that the basic idea is that every one of these elements on the periodic table is the foundation for what makes up everything in the world, the literal manifestation of the Earth. And there's been a fascinating body of work done by Professor Robert Moon from the University of Chicago. Robert Moon died a few years ago, but he published his research in the 1980s. Now, Professor Robert Moon was a professor emeritus at the University of Chicago, and what he had as his theory of the actual structure of the periodic table, which is obscured for us by the Mendeleev table that I just showed you, this type of rectangular table where it's all broken up into blocks, that will show certain relationships in the periodic table, but it will obscure others. Remember that Walter Russell showed the periodic table as a form of a spiral or a vortex. And what Robert Moon demonstrated is that the periodic table can be modeled on the form of the Platonic solids. And so what he showed is that the placement, especially of the protons in the nucleus, related to the construction of the Platonic solids, so that the first form created is as the protons build up and you go from element to element on the periodic table, you get to element number 8, oxygen, related to the form of a cube. That's what you see in this cutaway here. It's the nested Platonic solids. And so you have the cube here. There are 8 corners on the cube. So as you go from element to element, you can build up more and more places for the proton until at 8 you've completed a solid, and that gives you element 8, which is oxygen. Then if you go up to the next one, its dual is the form of the octahedron. And then you have another 6 places to add, to a total of 14. And element number 14 on the periodic table is the element of silicon. Then with the icosahedron, you get 12 more placements, and that gives you the element number 26, which is iron. Then, if you add in the form of the dodecahedron, it has 20 corners or vertices, which become the nesting points for the protons in the nucleus. And that then brings you up to element number 46, which is palladium. And so at this point, you've got a completed set. Now for his system, tetrahedron doesn't come in here. The tetrahedron is actually connected to other forces inside the atom. But for simplicity, we're going to keep it to this for the moment, because there's some very important relationships in the moon model of the periodic table. So the completed dodecahedron with the other 3 solids inside of it is at element number 46, palladium. We don't tend to hear a whole lot about palladium, but it's a very important substance, and I'll tell you why in just a minute. But then he shows that because this perfectly gives you the number 46, half the periodic table, if you had 2 dodecahedra with the other forms nested inside, that would give you perfectly the number of elements that naturally exist on the periodic table, exactly the number 92, which then gives you uranium. And what he shows is that as you've finished the first dodecahedron, then you're going to create the next set of structures. And the 2 dodeca will end up being connected first, face to face. But at some point, you're going to have to break them apart to free up some more of the vertices on the second dodeca. And so at that point, you're then going to have them connected like a hinge on a particular line. Then to free up more spaces, you're going to have to break that apart so that now they're just connected like a pivot at one point. And to get to the point that you then create the final form and you get the uranium, you're going to have to break the 2 apart entirely. Now there's an old esoteric tradition that has to do with 2 dodeca connected to one another that is the emblem of the macrocosm connected to the microcosm. And so symbolically, breaking apart the 2 dodecahedra is a rendering apart of the macrocosm with the microcosm. And what the result of that is, in the actual periodic table, in the moon model, is that you then come to these highly radioactive elements. Because by breaking these things apart, you're releasing radiation. Things are going out of existence and they're becoming highly toxic and emanating these highly lethal energies as they're beginning to move matter out of existence. So it's a very interesting model that shows the relationship of the Platonic solids to the periodic table, which is literally everything that makes up our world. But there's something else about it too, and that is, again, the Greeks had said that the manifestation of the earth comes from the Platonic solids. And you find something very interesting. The first completed form with the cube, which again with the 8 vertices, gives you the element number 8, which is oxygen on the periodic table, the completed cube. And oxygen equals 62.55% of all atoms in the Earth's crust. The next form that you come to by getting its dual, the octahedron, added in, gives you element number 14, silicon. Silicon is 21.22% of all the atoms in the Earth's crust. Together they form 84% of all the atoms that make up the actual surface structure of the Earth itself. Once again, a demonstration of what the Greeks had said, that the Platonic solids are the foundation for the creation of the Earth. Also look at the way that with the first form being created being oxygen, connected to the form of the cube with its 8 vertices, with the 8th element of oxygen, that we've been using this entire time the model of the cube as the element of manifestation. And it has literally manifested the majority of the atoms that make up the Earth's surface. Now, he also said that the Greeks had warned that if the form of the dodecahedron was made public, at some point it might be manipulated in such a way as to cause tremendous destruction. Now, as it turns out, Professor Robert Moon had worked on the Manhattan Project. How did he figure out that the Platonic solids were connected to this particular structure of the periodic table? He had worked on the Manhattan Project in World War II, which was the creation of the first nuclear weapon. And if you're familiar with the history of this project, which I became familiar with, of course, working in the Marine Corps in the nuclear biological chemical field, and then I found particular documents related to it, and I'm going to show you a few of those documents now. All of this is non-classified. It's stuff that's publicly available in particular text. And so the first nuclear weapon is the prototype for the Fat Man bomb, and it's what they call the gadget. It's within this particular form here. And then they erected it at Trinity Sands, New Mexico, and became the foundation for the first nuclear weapon. Now, if you take away that spherical shell that you saw around it, what's revealed is the interior components of a Fat Man type implosion bomb. Again, this is from a declassified Department of Defense document. The spherical shell of 12 pentagonal sections contains explosive lenses surrounding a uranium tamper and a plutonium core. You know now what 12 pentagonal sections are. And what you're seeing here is the outline of a dodecahedron. The first nuclear weapon was a dodecahedron. And we know what the consequences of nuclear weapons are. It is exactly what the Greeks predicted. It is causing tremendous destruction. It takes things out of existence. That's why when the first nuclear weapon went off, I believe it was Robert Oppenheimer, one of the original witnesses, gave a citation from the Bhagavad Gita, I am come as death, the destroyer of worlds, because he observed what had happened. That breaking of the atom and the manipulation of this particular geometry had then led to the release of these destructive forces. Again, the dodecahedron being related to ether, the dynamic life force itself. Now, we also mentioned that the completed dodecahedron on the periodic table, according to the Moon model, Professor Robert Moon's model of the periodic table, brings us to element number 46, which says palladium. And the average person on the street is not very familiar with palladium, but certain types of energy researchers are very familiar with palladium. Now, there's a particular type of free energy research that you've probably heard of, at least in passing, which is cold fusion. It has other names like new hydrogen energy, things of that kind. Now, the problem with cold fusion is that the original discoverers of it, who were Pons and Fleischmann, published their articles that they had found that in their experimental setup, they could get a lot more energy out than they put in. The problem is that some people were able to replicate their experiments and get that same amount of extra energy out, or sometimes more, sometimes a little less, but others were not able to replicate it at all. That then led to a great furor of, is cold fusion real or not? And it was fairly quickly suppressed. But the aspect of this that is important is that because you're dealing with the form of the dodecahedron and you are dealing with these types of dynamic life energies, those life energies are affected by all types of dynamics. And as we'll see tomorrow in our studies of the Earth grid, this includes things like the sun's relationship to the Earth, and the point on the Earth that you are doing the experiment at the time, and even who the person is that's doing the experiment. In some cold fusion research, they got no reaction at all. Other times they got a lot of excess energy. And in one famous incident, one researcher got so much energy building up so fast that his research gear actually exploded and killed him in his laboratory. So this demonstrates the way that the amount of energy that comes from the experimental setup is highly variable. So what's making the variation? Because modern science doesn't deal with etheric energies. It doesn't deal with variations in energy according to time and location and these other variables. They said, well, it can't exist. Even though this fellow died from the explosion, even though all these other people were able to get this reaction, if it doesn't work exactly the same way every time, it's got to be an illusion, because we just won't deal with it in our concepts in that case. Nonetheless, there's still a lot of research going on into it because it does work in the right time and place. But if you begin to look into how they set up the experiments to get the extra energy, you find that in the vast majority of experiments set up, including the original Pons and Fleischmann process, they used a variety of things. Like they used a palladium cathode and a platinum anode for the two particular electrical charges, and heavy water solution with a current-carrying electrolyte. Now, the thing about it is that palladium is actually part of the platinum group of metals. We're not going to go into that right now, but let's just say that for our purposes, many of these processes of so-called cold fusion, and it's probably not really cold fusion at all, which didn't help their cause, but it's some other type of reaction, involve palladium. So you see palladium used in the Pons and Fleischmann process, and in this process, and in many of the processes palladium was an absolutely key structure that they used in the creation of the effect. So that, why is it that they're using the palladium? From our perspective with the moon model of the periodic table, it's because they've now come to that element with the completed Platonic solid series and the dodecahedron, which is the pattern itself of the etheric life force. So by using the element that is created with the dodecahedron, you are then getting these anomalous results of energy. But because it's etheric, and etheric energy is a dynamic force that works in a whole matrix of the energies of the net of the earth, they're getting variable results from it. Now there's a very interesting project that they did at the Pennsylvania State University. And this particular article is actually in your handout. If you take a look at the second series of handouts, you'll find the actual page from New Scientist magazine that I copied for you that tells about this project. Now the upshot of it is that they were trying to find a cheap and easy way to break down organic poisons, and that would even allow them to dispose of nerve gas and chemical weapons, which are highly toxic and at this moment are just being stored in rotting containers in various containment places, in caves, and not infrequently surreptitiously dumped into the oceans just to get rid of them. So that they've done this with a wide variety of chemical and nuclear agents. So that's one reason why the seas are dying today. But what they said is that they found that they could create a particular process. They discovered the method when they noticed that dissolved organic compounds in contact with the metal palladium tend to oxidize, the process in which a molecule loses electrons and combines with oxygen. How compounds become sufficiently oxidized to break down completely is still poorly understood. But nonetheless, they then found that they could break down these toxic substances, even something like nerve gas, completely, so that it would become completely inert and harmless chemicals. So again, the application of the metal palladium for an alchemical process, because that's what the dodecahedron is connected to, and in this case the element palladium, for the etheric life force and the alchemical transmutation of elements. Now we also see the use of the dodecahedron for healing purposes, such as in this diagram, coming once again from the work of Theo Gimbel at the Hygeia Institute in Britain, where they work with color healing and use of forms, things like that. And I have some citations for his books in your handout. And they use this model of a double dodecahedron for the energy outline of a human being. And again, Theo Gimbel is another one of these people, though he's British. He actually is also connected to the work of Rudolf Steiner, which gave him some of the inspiration for his work. Actually, as there's an interesting story, that the person who developed kymatics, and we talked about kymatics before. Kymatics is where you put a sound frequency into a substance and it then forms into a geometric template. The fellow that developed kymatics is actually a medical doctor in Switzerland named Hans Jenny. And Hans Jenny was actually the family doctor to Theo Gimbel's family when he was a young man. In fact, Theo Gimbel, as a young man, the fellow that founded this healing institute in Britain, had broken his spine hiking in the mountains as a young man. And Hans Jenny was the one who found him, and although supposedly he was never supposed to recover from his broken spine, the type of energy work that Hans Jenny did with him managed to lead to a complete recovery for Theo Gimbel as a young man. And that, plus looking into the research background of Hans Jenny, which was Rudolf Steiner's work, led Theo Gimbel to this type of work. So he uses the form of a double dodecahedron with the other Platonic solids inside of it, so that they will use the different Platonic solids in particular color combinations to connect to different systems in the person's body. So of course, to connect to the watery systems, the metabolic system in a person's body, they'll use the icosahedron. To connect to the respiratory system, which is connected to air, they would use the octahedron. To connect to the sensory system and fire, of course, they would use the tetrahedron. So interesting applications of these principles. And what's shown here is that they started working with the angles on the dodecahedron, and they would put those angles in the corner of a room for an energetic effect. So you're getting that angular relationship and effect by putting that in the room itself. And they also would build these dodecahedral types of chambers that they would have people go in for energetic effects or as a place for healing. And this is a chart from another one of Theo Gimbel's works that's in your resource guide, talking about the different solids and how they saw their psychological effect, their physiological effect, and their therapeutic use. So, for instance, with the octahedron, psychological effect is the expansion into timelessness, the physiological effect is hyperventilation, and the therapeutic use reduces an introverted personality, detachment with direction, but can also induce tension. And so all of these things have particular things that they understood about the physical and psychological effects of these particular solids when they connected them to particular color qualities as well. Next. Now, I mentioned before about the Platonic duals, and we saw this dual relationship between the octahedron and the cube, to where the corner of the octahedron connects to the center of a face of the cube, and vice versa. Again, this perfect complementary relationship, in this case, between the solids connected to the earth element and to the air element. Now, this is true for all the Platonic solids. For the dodecahedron and the icosahedron, if you look at their structure, the dodecahedron has 12 faces and 20 corners, whereas the icosahedron has 20 faces and 12 corners. That means that once again they have a perfect dual relationship. So what we see here is the icosahedron on the outside of a dodecahedron, and its corners come to the exact center point of all 12 faces of the dodeca. But the dodeca on the outside, the exact same thing. The internal corner of the icosahedron comes to the center of the plane face of the dodeca. So they are duals. Now their dual relationship is between the element of water and the element of ether. And there's a classical relationship between that of ether and water, that the etheric life substance is connected to water itself. Now for the element of the periodic table of the Platonic solids related to fire, that of the tetrahedron, the tetrahedron is said to be self-dual, because if you get a tetrahedron and put it inside a tetrahedron has 4 corners and it has 4 faces. So an inverted tetrahedron inside a tetrahedron has a perfect dual relationship. It is self-dual. And if you were to make it so that then the corners would come out of the sides, then you'd get the star tetrahedral form. And in fact, all the different Platonic solids relate to each other, not in perfect dual relationships like the ones I just described, but they do nest inside one another in particular types of relationships that is just simply too complex to get into here. This is a chart from the book Order in Space by Keith Critchlow that shows you those relationships of one solid inside another, so that for the tetrahedron shows the relationship of every solid inside of it. So there's a lot more there. Also, you can start nesting the forms together in particular numbers, and you get other types of shapes, which are extremely interesting. So that, for instance, these are nested octahedra together, and these are nested cubes together, and these are nested dodecahedra together, and these are nested icosahedra. So when you interpenetrate them, you get these other very interesting types of forms. Now there's another aspect of this that particularly comes out in Buckminster Fuller's work, where he shows these net patterns. For instance, in this case, if you get the net pattern of the triangle and you break it up into the 4 triangles we saw before, but then you break up each sub-triangle into 4 and color one of the triangles within it, the central triangle. Then if you fold it up into the tetrahedron, then the colored place of the center of each one of the sub-triangles then forms into the body of an octahedron. So there's all types of relationships here. Now the Platonic solids are related to particular types of harmonic numbers, and there's quite a bit of detail about this in your handout, and we'll talk more about it tomorrow. But just a couple of things to bring out. We talked about the way that the tetrahedron is based on 720 degrees. If you look at the degrees of every angle on the body of the tetrahedron, it all adds up to 720 degrees. Octahedron 1440, all multiples of 720, the way we described before. But if you then get all 5 of the Platonic solids and add them together, you get the harmonic number 144, 14,400. And of course the number 144 is a very important harmonic number, and we'll be talking more about it again tomorrow. We're laying a foundation now for our discussion of the solids and the actual form of the Earth and the Earth grid that we're going to wind the course up with tomorrow. Now also, every one of the forms is connected to these numerical values according to the 3, 4, 5 harmonic. So 1 times 3 plus 4 plus 5 times 3 times 4 times 5 also leads to these particular totals of numbers. 2 times, 3 times, 5 times, 9 times, like we saw in Buckminster-Fuller's chart. But now we're seeing there's also the relationship that these numbers times 3 plus 4 plus 5 times 3 times 4 times 5, once again, the 3, 4, 5 harmonic leads to the same numbers. So it's, again, this exquisite, interrelated series of numbers that leads to all of these forms and everything in creation. If you look at particular text coming from particularly theosophical sources, there's one called The Mathematics of the Cosmic Mind that's in your resource guide. It's very hard to find today, but it's a very interesting book. Mathematics of the Cosmic Mind by L. Gordon Plummer describes the esoteric relationships as seen by the theosophist of these various solids. And they relate it, for example, to particular ratios. For instance, the planetary time periods, their rotational periods, orbit around the sun, etc., of these various planets are in particular numbers to each other, so that Mercury's time period compared to the Earth is in a 4-to-1 ratio. Mars to Jupiter is 6-to-1. Mercury to Mars is 8-to-1. And so you then find that these particular ratios with the planets and their time periods actually then relate to the same types of ratios that you get with the harmonic numbers connected to the tetrahedron, the cube, octahedron, dodecahedron in the faces, in the number of vertices, and the number of edges. So again, more of this whole cosmic sacred geometry that we talked about before. Now there's a very interesting aspect of this where there are stellated forms or star forms that can either be created connecting to the vertices by putting the star form inside the particular Platonic solids, in this case inside a dodecahedron, and in this case inside an icosahedron. So they can either be created inside or they can be created on the exterior of the form. And in fact, Chris at the back had built a very nice stellated dodecahedron, if you want to hold that up. The center of that is a dodecahedron, and then he has stellated all of the faces outward. So that's a beautiful form. Thank you. So this gives you an example of how some of these stellations work. This stellation of the dodecahedron is built from a layer of these 12 forms put on top of every face. Essentially what you do is you simply extend the lines out until they meet at a point, and that gives you the stellated point for every one of the faces. But you can create different types of stellations by putting different types of forms on them, like wedge shapes on the top, and then you get this type of stellation pattern, which has this beautiful raised 5-pointed star pattern on every pentagonal face. So it's important to know that all these forms can be stellated and made into a radiating star form. Now this brings us to the topic of higher dimensions. And we'll be doing a little bit more of this tomorrow as well. But let's look at the basic concept of higher dimensions. In spiritual circles, we often use the term higher dimensions to talk about the concept of how higher planes or spiritual worlds, non-physical worlds or worlds in a different vibratory rate somewhere, would relate to our physical world. And so people use the term higher dimensions in a number of different contexts. So in a very interesting work called The Fourth Dimension by Rudy Rucker, again in your resource guide, he talks about the relationship of the astral plane to the physical world using the metaphor of Flatland, or a two-dimensional world, and how it would relate to our 3 dimensions of space. Because a two-dimensional world has length and breadth, but it has no depth. That means that if you were a being living in a two-dimensional world, which from the book Flatland is called A square lives in this two-dimensional world, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, out of the blue, out of the ether, there develops this point. And you can see the expression on his face as the point then opens up to become this circle that gets larger and larger, and he's extremely discomforted by this, until finally it goes back to a point, it disappears, and he convinced himself that it's something that never even existed because nobody believes in it, and so this kind of thing really can't happen after all. So that's simply the way that a third-dimensional object would appear passing through a two-dimensional surface, and the way that a dweller in a two-dimensional world would see it happen. So we then use the Flatland metaphor for how higher dimensional objects might appear to us passing through a 3-dimensional space. This could also potentially relate to the types of pictures I showed you yesterday from the work of Trevor James Constable and that Italian group that was taking these infrared photographs of things appearing and disappearing from space. Now, in some aspects of physics, they will talk about the fourth dimension as being the fourth dimension of time. That's the basic Einsteinian space-time concept. The fourth dimension is time. Now, to give you a simple metaphor of this, the way that Rudy Rucker shows it in his book is that you have particular places in time so that they're all connected together into a particular structure. The time flow is going this way, and so 12 o'clock, 12:05, 12:10, and a simple way to explain what he's talking about is, let's say that you and I are going to meet. And I could say, okay, I'm going to meet you downtown in Asheville right at the obelisk. Great. But you go there and I'm not there. Well, it might be because we hadn't identified the fourth dimension of time. I was there an hour later. So the spatial aspect is there, but without the fourth aspect of time, you cannot isolate the particular crossing or meeting point. So the fourth dimension of time relates to our actual activity with space. However, there are other ways of looking at the fourth dimension where it is not time, but it is a fourth spatial dimension. And so we describe the way that the three axes of physical space make this type of cubical cross, a three-axis cross. And that all of these at 90 degrees, you can't bring in to the cube of our physical world, which has the three axes, another 90-degree axis. Simply doesn't exist in our world, but doesn't mean that theoretically another 90-degree axis doesn't exist, but we can't even perceive it, because within our box and our structure, it's not perceptible. And by the same token, the way that we are structured in a physical body, we are structured to perceive three-dimensional realities. But if these higher realities were to exist, if these higher dimensions were to exist, they can be analyzed according to mathematics and geometry. And that's what we described earlier today, like with the works of HMS Coxeter and his work on books like Regular Polytopes describing these higher dimensional forms. So one of the fundamental forms that we would look at is from the zero dimensionality of a point to the one dimensionality of a line to the two dimensionality of a square to the three dimensionality, now with length, breadth, and depth, of a cube, that if we were to then add in the fourth dimension, we would then get a hypercube. Just like it took me, I had my initial line. If I put another line there, I then have to connect the lines up, giving me 4 lines to create the next dimension. I then took a square and added another square. But to connect them so that it can enclose 3 dimensions, I had to add 4 more squares to it. So what that basically means is now I've got the 6-sided structure of a cube. Now the same thing is true in working with the form of the cube, that in putting one cube next to the next cube to enclose 4th dimensional space, I have to use more multiple cubes. So this is actually a projection of multiple cubes together in a particular form, not only projected into 3 dimensions, but now into 2 dimensions. And that's the form that you've created with the hypercube. So that it basically breaks down into a set of 6 cubes. Because in addition to the 2 cubes you started with, you had to add more cubes to enclose the 4th dimensional space. And again, we're looking at the case of the hypercube that you built being a 3-dimensional shadow of a 4th dimensional object. The same as the form of, let's say, a hexagon could be a 2-dimensional shadow of a 3-dimensional cube. And a couple of things I want to bring out about this. That if you're going to project a 3-dimensional cube on a 2-dimensional surface like you see here, what you will inevitably get is that the forms that you see on the cube will not necessarily be a straight square. To be able to show a higher dimensional object in a lower dimensional space, in this case the 3-dimensional cube is shown on the 2-dimensional projection that you see in front of you, look at the actual form that you get for those faces. Some of them might still show up looking like a square, but the others are then forced to take a particular form. That form is that of a rhombic diamond. So if you can clearly see the rhombic diamond form created by the dimensional stress of trying to represent a higher dimensional object in a lower dimensional space, this is something very important to recognize, that the rhombic diamond form is a sign of dimensional stress and of a higher dimensional form in a lower dimensional projection. In fact, if you take a look at the form of the rhombic dodecahedron that you just built, you'll see the entire thing is bounded by the rhombic form. So geometries get ratcheted when they have to go from one dimension to a lower dimension. And so that's the rhombic dodecahedron that you built. And tomorrow you'll build another very important form that we'll be talking more about tomorrow, which is the rhombic triicosahedron. And we do have forms in nature that correspond to the rhombic dodecahedron, 12-sided structure. Every side is this rhombic diamond form that you see right here. So the rhombic diamond is a sign of dimensional stress and shift. So if you understand that principle, then when you see the use of the rhombic diamond form in particular things in spiritual practices, spiritual images, for forms in the phenomenal world, or for blueprints of different forms, like the particular rhombic diamond form that you get when you connect the two triangles together for the template for something like the cathedral, you begin to get another aspect of what this rhombic diamond form is all about. And let's remember that when we create our overlapping of the two vesica, of the two circles, creating the vesica form, we then connect it up to create this rhombic diamond form. So we actually get that inside the vesica. We would get more than one of them if we then overlapped 3 circles, as you see here. So this is a deeper aspect of this whole thing about the dimensional projection, that you start simply through pure observation, observing this rhombic diamond form. I actually haven't seen this described in any text. It seems so obvious to me that it's undeniable, but I've never seen any text externally describe it. What I have seen, though, are that there are particular spiritual groups that use the rhombic form for some highly advanced spiritual purposes. But none of them have ever described this connection of it to the higher dimensional state and the higher dimensional stress. But again, I think it's something that is self-evident through pure observation. Here's a particular form coming in the Jewish Kabbalistic tradition that they use for spiritual protection and spiritual connection, again with this type of diamond form. Same type of thing you'd see in the center of the Vesica. And these forms are very interesting. These are actually found in old sites in what is modern-day Britain. And they were shown and described in Keith Critchlow's book, Time Stands Still, that I described before. And he's contemplating that perhaps they're a type of a wedge template that could be used to make particular divisions of a circle. And that's possible. But the fact that they are not only these particular rhombic diamond shapes, but they also have concentric rhombic diamond shapes inside of them, suggests to me that they had some other purpose. I think there's something more to that story. Now, there are other projections that you could have of a hypercube to try to represent particularly the mathematical aspects of these higher dimensional forms in lower dimensional space. One is of a cube inside a cube. And then you have the faces of them providing these other hypercube aspects. But also remember that this cube within a cube might be related to what we showed you before in the painting by Walter Russell, where he showed you nature's method of creating power, which was this sequence of cubes within cubes within cubes. You could also take the 6 cubes, or take the multiple cubes that make up the hypercube and put it into a particular form, where it would then show you the aspects of the cubes themselves. So this becomes this type of cubical cross form. And it's similar to what you get when you unfold the form of a cube into a cross. Only now you get this cubical form of the cross that was used by Salvador Dali in this particular painting of the Crucifixion of Christ. Basically the Crucifixion of Christ on a hypercube, rather than the unfolded cube, which is the cross. Now this brings us to the Archimedean solids. The Archimedean solids are the forms that you get when you begin to modify the shapes of the Platonic solids in a particular way. And so by modifying the forms of the Platonic solids, you get a whole nother series of forms. And these are not perfect forms like the Platonic solids. They usually have a combination of particular types of faces. So they might have a combination of triangular faces and pentagonal and square, or even other numbers of faces such as octagonal or 10-sided. To give you another image of how this works, these Archimedean solids, which we're not going to do much with in this class, it becomes more involved, but what you should be aware of is that these, with the basis of the Platonic solids, the Archimedean polyhedra are often based on truncating the form of one of the Platonic solids so that you're cutting corners off of them. So here's a truncated cube, and you've made another form by cutting corners off the form. So this is one method, which is truncation. Then there's another method called snubbing. And when you snub it, you're also making cuts and modifications to the form, which then leads to these other shapes. So in a sense, these are further subdivisions, cuts that are made to the Platonic solids, giving rise to these forms. And this is simply a schematic showing you the way that the Platonic solids are then affected by snubbing or truncation or other types of modification to give you all of these Archimedean polyhedra. So we just want you to be aware of the fact that these types of Archimedean solids exist. And a very important form for us is the cube octahedron that we described before. So we want to be familiar with the cube octahedron. It's a little hard to build with the Zohm toolkit unless you have the green line, so we're not building it here. But the basic idea of it again, this is the one that Buckminster Fuller called the vector equilibrium, because if you look at the distance from the very center of the form to any of the corners, the vertices on the form, they're all exactly the same length. So in other words, vector equilibrium, or equal distances from the center to the periphery. Now this is connected to the 12 around the 1 we described before. If I have a central sphere, and I put 3 spheres on the top, 3 spheres on the bottom, 6 around to perfectly cover that central sphere, and I was to then to make lines connecting the center of all 12 spheres that cover the central sphere, then I would get the perfect form of a cube octahedron. Now the interesting thing about the cube octahedron, for our immediate purposes, is that the cube octahedron also has a dual, and it turns out that its dual is the form of the rhombic dodecahedron which you've built. If you were to put them together, you'd see that they are perfect duals to each other. So that one has 12 vertices and 14 faces, and one has 14 vertices and 12 faces. So again, Platonic duals between these two forms. There's also these extremely energetically powerful and mystical forms that are called prisms. And the prisms take forms like this. This is like a 5-pointed star. You see how it then moves down in a straight projection. These are particular prism-type forms. And there are particular systems today that use these prisms for energetic and, in some cases, for magical purposes, such as the light language system that I referenced for you before, developed by Star Fuentes, who lives in Texas. And among the forms that they use are the forms of these particular prisms. Very interesting forms energetically. Next. And that brings us to Buckminster Fuller. I want to make a few comments here about Buckminster Fuller's work. Again, it would be a whole workshop in itself to look at all the things Bucky did, because he has an absolutely incredible body of work. But this is Bucky here working with his students on creating these patterns and understanding is that of all these Platonic solids in virtually any structure, the triangular structure is the strongest. And that for the triangle to be deformed into another shape, it actually has to almost turn itself inside out. It's much harder to deform the form of a tetrahedron than it is the form of a cube, for example. And so he said, no, if you understand triangulation, the actual form this thing is built on will be self-sustaining within the scaffolding. And so it has all these different students that are all hanging on it, and here's Bucky himself hanging on it simultaneously. And they're surprised at just how strong that structure was. Again, it's an aspect of synergetics, or synergy, which is to create the maximum effect with the minimal amount of effort or material. And this is what he's talking about here, that this particular thing of applying pressure, it's self-bracing. So it takes a lot to make it actually have to turn itself inside out to begin to deform. And it's much easier to do it on other types of forms, particularly on cubes. That's why we would put a form of the tetrahedron inside the cube to support it. And he then demonstrates that with the structural integrity of a geodesic form. Now he also shows the way that if you look at what's called space fillers, there are particular forms that will fill all of three-dimensional space, like cubes. You can put one cube next to another cube, and it will completely solidly fill space. But many forms won't do that. You can't do it with just octahedra or just tetrahedra, but the tetrahedra and octahedra together will fill all of space. So they can form a pair together. And so when you get the octahedra and connect it to the tetrahedra, it creates this type of scaffolding that he called a tet-octa truss, or in some cases an octet truss. So the bringing together of these two forms will fill all of space. And the tet-octa truss is something that he used for a lot of his structural supports in building things. Very, very solid. And you could actually create the form of a cube in the intersecting lines of it. So that if you actually look at the form of a cube and you put the star tetrahedron of the two tetrahedra inside of it, you'd have other spaces left. That if you had other cubes connected to the outside of it, it would all connect together to a whole system of tetrahedra and octahedra, tetrahedra and octahedra, for a very solid, stable structure in a way that the cube itself is not stable. And this leads us also to another important concept of structural integrity from Bucky, which is called tensegrity. And we touched on it before. Tensegrity has to do with the way that you can brace different elements together so that in their mutual juxtaposition, they actually create a very strong structure through the combination of tension and compression. And so things that you wouldn't think would be a strong, stable structure actually do stay together in the way that they are counterbalanced. And this is also connected to what we talked about before with the element of the tetrahedra stabilizing things in space. And so there's a patent on this hanging bookshelf. The bookshelf is actually suspended in space, but it stays very rigidly in place because the lines connecting it are connected to this type of tetrahedral matrix that we described before. So this is a concept of tensegrity, that if you have the right support lines going to the right place, then even this heavy hanging bookshelf will stay stable in one location. Is that the last slide? Is it giving you the beach ball of death? Yes. Okay. Well, we're coming to a close here anyway. It's about 5 o'clock. And let me make a quick comment for people here that have to okay, we'll come to that in just a second. That for the folks here who are not staying on site but have to do driving at any distance today, you do want to try to get home fairly quickly tonight. In fact, it's starting to snow outside a little bit. And it's supposed to get fairly cold tonight. It might be some high winds. So don't go out late tonight. We're going to end here in just a moment. And let those of us who have to drive go ahead and get home. But we're going to do our best to get in here on time tomorrow. We'll still start at 10 o'clock. Particularly, Jane will get here on time, no matter what. And so let's be aware of that situation tonight. Well, let's end on this one, the jitterbug transformation. This is from Bucky's work, where he showed that there is a very interesting relationship between various forms. And there are actually little toys that are made of this, in which it's got these flexible pieces here connected together, so it will bend at all of the intersections. And so it starts with the form of a cube octahedron. And then he shows if you start to ratchet it so it forms into another form, it actually will take the form related to an icosahedron. So he says the jitterbug transformation is where the form, through its movement, will move from a cube octahedron to the form of an icosahedron, and then it will collapse down and become the form of an octahedron. And then it will collapse down further and become the form of a tetrahedron. So the jitterbug transformation is how all these forms move from one to the next. Okay, that's going to do it for today. It's 5 o'clock, and I don't think we're going to do questions today, so that those of us who need to get home will go ahead and start on our journey. But we'll do questions tomorrow morning. And tomorrow is going to be the last day of our course. You are going to need all of the forms that you built today, and you're even going to do a couple more in the morning. And we're going to then explore the application of these forms to the Earth grid, and you'll do a particular exercise during the day, particularly with some of the hyperdimensional forms. So again, keep your forms together, and we'll be using them tomorrow. So I will see you all tomorrow.